G'day, ZiggyD here and welcome to some Devilian. Devilian is an action RPG MMO hybrid. It is an MMO that incorporates very Diablo-like combat into it. So rather than having your standard tab targeting that many MMOs have, or having some of the action combat that many other MMOs are taking these days, the game has gone for a much more Diablo-like style of combat, that action RPG combat that we come to know from isometric loot-based action RPGs. Now, the game has some other action RPG influences in the loot system, and some of the other pieces of content that you can engage in. But it is very much an MMO. Like, the meta game of the game is an MMO. There's questing like you'd expect in an MMO, and there's dungeons like you'd expect in an MMO, and the world is massively multiplayer outside of those dungeons. And yet the combat itself is actually a fairly solid example of action RPG combat that comes together quite well. My first impressions of the combat in this game were actually very positive because it was fun right off the bat. Most MMOs you play for a while and you find that they tend to get fun the further you get into it, like the closer you get to endgame. I've been playing this game for about 16 to 18 hours now, and almost right off the bat, I was impressed at the feel of the combat, because this feels strong even by action RPG standards, which I was kind of surprised about, to be honest, because I was expecting, when most games become MMOified in some fashion, you take a game and you kind of put it on top of an MMO metagame, then usually you tend to sacrifice a few things. But the action combat in this game is good even by action RPG standards. Like, it feels really good. The skills themselves all have impacts. You'll notice when I use my skills that enemies will reel back, there'll be hit effects, sometimes enemies will become stunned, and they all feel quite impactful. And it's actually fairly surprising that all of the skills that I've tested on my class, of all of the skills I've tested, only one of them I haven't really liked. Usually in most action RPGs, I'm trying to find like the skills that I enjoy. Most of them will be okay, or in some cases, only a couple skills will be okay in each class, and I'll build a build around those skills. So far, there's only been, in my class here, one skill that I didn't really like, which was lightning spread, which is just kind of a multi-shot skill. It just kind of felt fizzly, didn't really have any impact to it, so I re-spec'd out of that quite quickly. I've been speccing into the control tree. For each different class, there are 3 different trees of skills, and you can spec however you like between the 3 different trees. I focused almost entirely on the control tree of the Evoker so far, and all of the skills on this tree feel really solid. And then on top of that, which is a little interesting by action RPG standards, is that you can actually move and cast a lot of spells. Now, I'm not sure how true this is for the other classes yet, having only played the Evoker so far, but a lot of the Evoker spells can actually be moved while casting. Now, some of them you must stand still to cast, like this Fireball, for example, and that Black Hole, for example, but many of them I can actually cast while moving, including this ultimate ability here, that Giganto Meteor that blows everything up. So this creates a pretty nice sort of mobility system. You spend time sort of grouping up enemies using, a basic AoE ability. You'll group them up, and then you might use displacement abilities to try and group them up even further. And you'll kind of like kite them through these abilities while grouping enemies in a very action RPG-like fashion. It's something you'd expect to do in something like on an endgame build in Diablo or in Path of Exile, where you might try and group up as many enemies as possible and burst them down with your more powerful AoE ability. It's very much what you'd like to see out of one of those sorts of games. It's got that same sort of feeling to it, and it feels really quite impressive. I actually like this being able to move while casting business, because this is common in MMOs. Most of the time, a lot of MMOs, they'll either take the decision where you can circle strafe endlessly while attacking, or you get locked to the spot when you attack. And MMOs kind of tend to fall in either of those regards. In most MMOs, combat, with its standard tab targeting combat or pseudo action combat a la Guild Wars, or even the more action combat heavy games, I don't really like when you can move all the time while attacking, because it creates a pretty tiresome metagame of circle strafing. In this game, however, because this is click to move, now you can use WASD to move, though I don't know why you would. It feels far, far worse. You can use a standard style action RPG control scheme by just clicking to move and casting with your mouse pointer aimed at a location and pressing the hotkey for that skill. And you can, of course, in an MMO fashion, you can set all of your own hotkeys. Now this creates a pretty smooth and fast-paced feeling combat system that is one of the better ones I've played in most MMOs. Now I'm a little bit biased in this front because in general I don't really enjoy MMO combat all that much. Tab targeting combat I find draining and tiresome. And even some of the more action combat MMOs I find maybe passable at best, something that I can kind of get through because I like some other parts of the game. So in general, not being a big fan of MMO combat, this is like a really refreshing sort of spin for me. And indeed, it's made even questing, you know, the generic MMO questing, because this game has very generic MMO questing, where you just go kill X amount of enemies, go fetch some items, go find some guy, find a missing item, over and over again through different zones and quest hubs and things like that. That's exactly what you'd expect from most MMOs these days. But because the combat is fun and because zones are full of tons and tons of enemies, then you get to kind of like round up all the enemies in an entire zone. You have probably like 3 fetch quests in that zone at the time. You round them all up and then just blast them down with your AoE skills. And everything dies on the screen all at once in very quick fashion, and it feels very satisfying. This is a combat system I much more enjoy than your regular MMO combat. So if you are a fan of the action RPG combat, and not so much MMO combat, but you kind of like some of the other things that MMOs offer, like, you know, large amounts of content for you to push through and for you to grind through, and having much more players present as you play the game, then this could well be an interesting sort of blend. Before I picked up this game, I was pretty concerned that this would be the case where, you know, you were really trading off some of the quality of the actual combat experience in order to you know, MMOify it, but I'm pretty pleased that hasn't well been the case. I think I actually need to burn these corpses here. Let's see if I can do that. Yes, I actually have to burn the corpses. Okay, so I'll explain in just a second kind of my character's build and setup and how I'm using my skills, because I haven't really done too much of that just yet. Now, I've actually been pinned to the spot just here and taken a bit of AoE damage. This dungeon here was one of the first kind of epic ones with these giant fire traps and stuff going off. This guy is kind of an elite enemy here that we have to kill before we can progress, so we need to dodge those fire traps because those do a lot of damage. So I'm actually running low on mana, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and, as soon as I break out of here, I'm going to try and freeze him and use my Chain Lightning. My Chain Lightning actually gives me mana back on hit, so I can fill up my mana that way and go back to using my Lightning Blast, which is my kind of like strongest damage dealing ability overall. Let's use my Meteor to try and finish some of these guys off here and finish off the fights. Very good stuff. So we can head through that way. I'll head into this next section of the dungeon, and I'll explain my build overall. We also have Devilian form charged up as well, which is a second part of the combat. So I've talked about my general sort of impressions on the combat and how the action RPG and MMO elements come together. But let's talk a little bit about more some of the specific sort of combat elements that as it presents itself on my actual character here, this control-based Evoker. So my primary skill that I've spec'd strongly into, in fact I have mastered the skill by inspecting everything into it, which makes it turn into a stronger variant of the skill, is my Lightning Blast skill here. So this is just a rather simple mid-sized AoE that occasionally, at the moment 75% of the time, will leave behind a swirling lightning damage over time effect. Now that stacks up and causes a lot of hits on enemies, and the initial explosion does a fairly decent amount of damage. It also has a good amount of single target, you know, boss and champion damage bonus as well. So it works fairly well as a boss killer. So that's my primary ability. So what I'll typically do is I'll round up some enemies with that, so I'll grab their attention with that, and typically by the time I've rounded up all the enemies in an area, so let's round up these guys here, and unleashed all of my mana. My mana does recharge fairly quickly, but when I'm unleashing this skill as much as possible, then I'm eventually going to run out of mana. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to group up as many enemies as possible with Black Hole. Now that will group them, and it'll give me mana back as well. I have a modifier on my Black Hole, one of the things that I can spec into, that causes my Black Hole to regenerate mana when per target hit. So I get 10 mana back per target hit, and I can hit a maximum of 9 targets. So I can actually get 90 mana back, which basically fills up my full mana bar, allowing me to unleash a heap more Lightning Blasts. So I can kind of keep that combo going quite a bit, unleash as many Lightning Blasts as possible, group up enemies with the Black Hole, and then continue unleashing some more Lightning Blasts to finish off whoever's alive. So if things have survived that, then typically what I'll do is I'll use my Ice Storm ability here, which slows and groups them. I can also combo that with my Lightning Blast to keep enemies grouped up to better deal my AoE damage. And then what I can actually do if I'm still out of mana after that and things are still alive, so let's say I'm out of mana, my black hole's on cooldown, then what I can actually do is use a freezing ability here, which is on my F1 key, and then I can unleash this chain lightning ability. Now, chain lightning per enemy hit also gives a small amount of mana returned as well, so I can use that to refill my mana. So I kind of balance and juggle these different skills here between Lightning Blast as my main damage dealing skill, Black Hole to group enemies and return my mana. I group enemies with the Icicle Storm and its slowing effect, also dealing some additional damage with that. I should really stay out of that fire. And then returning any mana back that I need to be able to continue sustaining my Lightning Blast with the Chain Lightning skill as well, which routes me to the spot, so to keep enemies away from me, because I am pretty squishy, I freeze them first with the Frostfield skill, which is kind of like a Cold Snap style skill. So those are my core skills there. I also have a caster buff, Mana Shield here, which allows me to absorb a percentage of my maximum health. So it essentially puts like an energy shield over the top of my life temporarily for a few seconds. And there's some other effects you can get with that, including move speed buffs and things like that as well. Let me grab some of this gold here. And then I also, on top of that, for anything that's kind of grouped up in lowish health, what I'll typically do is unleash a Meteor Strike, which is kind of like my big finisher control ability. It's one of the more powerful control abilities. I think I need to head back down the other way, so we're going to head out over this way. Spire Ground does a lot of damage, so we're going to try and dodge past that if we can. Looks like I needed to grab this guy. Here we go, and we can see who we'll be facing in just a moment over there. An interesting thing about my Meteor Strike and the way I've spec'd it so far is that it actually, jumping past there, is that if it gets a kill, it actually restores 3 seconds off its cooldown per kill gained. Oh, here we go, I was actually supposed to activate this one. I'm blind! Blind as a bat. There we go. Okay, now we can continue working our way around. We got a little taste of an upcoming boss there, but we have a little bit of work to do before we can get there. So I'll group up enemies here with my Lightning Blast, sort of deal a bit of damage there, group them up with my Black Hole, burst them down, and if there's anything less, we'll continue on our next skill rotation. Since another set of enemies has spawned here, I can use sort of my Ice Storm there to group and slow some of them. I might be able to ignite these piles of corpses, so I should probably do that rather than just fighting these guys over and over again. Let's burn these guys down here and then ignite this. So this is one such example of the dungeons. In the overworld, you have, fighting alongside other people, a lot of different questing with areas that are full of quite a few, I gotta get some more embers, here we go. Quite a few enemies in each zone. Some enemies are super mob dense as well, actually, like the same sort of density you'd expect to see in a Diablo Rift or in a Path of Exile map. Not quite as high as you can get in those games, because mobs do have set spawns and it's not quite as randomized and sometimes you have those maps that are really, really dense in other action RPGs, but still fairly dense by MMO standards compared to what I've seen a lot of the time. So let's group up these guys in Black Hole, get some of my mana back. I am going to run a little low on mana here though. So what I'll probably do is, whenever there's like a larger group, I can take advantage of that with my Chain Lightning, because the more enemies that are grouped together, the more I'm going to get that mana back, the faster I'm going to get it back. So let me get out of that fire though. I wonder if the enemies take damage from that. Looks like that's going to be it there. I'm going to hang out here, wait a little bit. Might as well use a potion since my health has been dropping. I've probably taken the most damage in this dungeon from these fire traps. Okay, we have a large elite here, so a tougher guy. You'll see some of the enemies have telegraphed attacks like that, so they'll leave an imprint on the ground. Only some things have tells like that. Like you saw his charging ability there, which more powerful attacks will typically have tells on larger champion enemies and bosses, but not everything does. You saw he did another attack that shot out 3 projectiles in front of him that didn't actually have like a telegraphed a ground effect like that that tells you to jump out of the way. We do have, every class has this mobility skill, which is just this kind of like little dash here. It's called teleport, but it's basically just a little dash that lets you jump forwards. So you can use that just to kind of get around and group up enemies, or you can use it to dodge out of the way of attacks and telegraphed abilities. I'm going to get my mana back here with my Chain Lightning. That does a little bit of damage too, not too bad. There's not really a large group of enemies for me to use Black Hole on, so I can't really do that there. There's something I haven't shown you guys yet. There's also this Devilian form, which essentially is kind of like an Archon mode or something for your character. It's like you go Super Saiyan, and mostly it's used for single target though. I managed to just jump in between those 2 projectiles there and finish that guy off. The Devilian form it's charged up through combat. Now you can see my Devilian gauge there, and once you activate it, you have a very short period of time in which you can unleash some very powerful single target damage. So I typically use it for boss killing or for nasty elite killing out in the overworld. Alright, so let's group these guys up here. I've seen a little bit of footage and things of some of the other classes, and I'll probably try and bring you guys some footage of the other classes soon. But so far I'm very impressed with the Evoker and how she plays, and I looked at a bunch of the different skill trees and skills and thought about how I could put them together, and I was pretty satisfied with what sort of how I was able to essentially come up with a build by comboing skills together and comboing different cooldowns, and especially mana return, this idea that this is a powerful AoE-based build that relies heavily on different skills that give mana return. And I quite like that setup and that I was able to execute that. So here we have a boss fight in the dungeon. The boss fights and the content in general in this game is really quite easy earlier on in the game. But around level 20, 25 to 27 mark, it starts to get a little more interesting and some of the fights get a little better. So I'm going to use all my mana here and use my cooldowns as much as possible. So I can't really freeze him. I'm probably see he hit me there and interrupted my chain lightning, unfortunately, so I can't do too much more. So I'll use all my cooldowns here. And I'll probably use my mana shield, try and tank him a little bit here. Let's use all these cooldowns to do as much damage as we can. Then I'm going to go Devilian form over here. Let's draw him up a little bit if we can. As you can see, I'm just about out of mana here, so I can use my crappy auto attack to deal a little tiny bit of damage as well. Wait. Alright, let me see if I can get some chain lightning. Do a little more damage to him before we go Devilian mode, because we want to do as much of that as we can, and we'll be able to probably do like a life bar and a half worth of damage, I think. Alright, I'm going to go Devilian mode here. So I hit V, and now I'm able to go into Devilian mode, this super powered mode here, which can deal a huge amount of single target damage. You can see some of the big hits I'm doing to his life bar there. Now, it is very short time, so I want to try and use my my Devilian mana, my Devilian power as efficiently as possible. You see, we took him down to his final life bar there, so huge amounts of Devilian. I'm a little over-leveled for this dungeon, and these lower-level dungeons aren't too difficult. But you can see the power of the Devilian form as far as single target goes. Apparently, PvP happens in Devilian form, as well as some other forms of endgame content will occasionally force you into a permanent Devilian form as well. He's using a few different AoE abilities here that we're probably going to want to dodge out of the way of. Just managing to avoid those rock falls. Let's use some chain lightning here. We're going to have to back it up though, because he's about to go for a sling. Yep, and we got him with a really nice crit. At the end there that did a good amount of damage and was able to finish him off. So that's the dungeon finished there. We get some rankings at the end of the dungeon here. I took a long time sort of setting up for my video, so we're not going to get an SS rank, I don't think. But we should get an S rank. There we go. If we score at least 2 out of 3 on that clear time and 3 out of 3 on everything else, we actually get an SS time, which allows us to get 3 spins of this loot wheel at the end here, so we can spin this for various different rewards. Let's give it a spin. I'm hoping for some XP or some Devil Souls, which allow us to level up our Devilian form. Magic Dust is not particularly valuable, so that's no good. One of these two would be perfect. Oh, well, I got a potion. I got a Devilian form potion, which heals us in Devilian form. So guys, that's been a first look at the combat gameplay in Devilian, as well as a bit of a run through a mid to low level dungeon, and a first look at the Evoker class as well. Overall, as I said, I'm pretty impressed at the combat in this game. It really is quite good, even by action RPG standards, so for that to be done in an MMO and seemingly be done quite well, I'm actually quite impressed, and the combat is good enough, even so, that it's carried what is, your typically fairly mundane MMO questing and made it actually quite fun. So my first impressions of the game, since what can you judge about an MMO in like less than 20 hours, right? And that's pretty much like combat and questing and just the general aesthetic of the game, just the general sort of feel of that initial sort of gameplay, and my first impressions of that overall are really quite solid. It's going to take some more time to analyze things like the longevity of the game and the monetization of the game, but my first impressions on just the core gameplay is that this game is actually quite fun. So that took me by surprise, and perhaps it'll take you guys by surprise as well. If you have any questions about the game so far and my initial impressions of it, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. That is it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.